Welcome. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Sarah Bania-Dobyns, and you might notice I have someone else with me here. This is a colleague of mine, Melanie Firstman, who's also an instructional designer, and she will be joining me later on in the later part of my presentation for some discussion. So thank you for being acknowledged first, Melanie, and we'll be looking forward to hearing more from you later. So I am a freelance instructional designer, an educational consultant, and an adjunct professor of communications and international affairs at the University of Denver. I came to the field of instructional design through my experience working in the interdisciplinary field of international studies, which is the field my PhD is in higher education. As a graduate student and then a faculty member, I developed a strong interest in writing pedagogy applied to multiple fields. As I gained expertise, I coached faculty in using writing to help their students learn more effectively. Then, as my freelance work expanded alongside my teaching, I began applying what I had learned about teaching writing in higher education to corporate instructional design contexts. So this talk is a practice-focused discussion of how I apply writing to learn in instructional design settings, which I hope will be useful to others. So it can be a challenge, what we do. As instructional designers, we often work with clients who expect their employees or stakeholders to digest large amounts of detailed, complex information. Clients also expect their employees to use the new knowledge gained in training in relationship with customers. So it's especially important that we find ways to guide learners in these trainings to deepen their thinking in ways that will help them digest the information and apply it. Learners, from restaurant employees to customer service reps to engineers, need to be able to use higher levels of thinking in their jobs. One response to this challenge is what's called writing to learn. Writing to learn is one way to facilitate that higher level of thinking. Here's what we're going to discuss. First, we'll discuss writing to learn in its original higher education context. Then we'll discuss how writing to learn can help learners develop and use higher level thinking in their work. And finally, we'll discuss a case study from instructional design to delve more deeply into what this looks like in practice. So, what is writing to learn? When we think about writing, we usually think about finished products that we create to communicate messages to others, like emails, websites, reports, articles, even text messages. But this form of writing is what's called transactional writing. It's writing that's created for an audience, so an exchange of ideas is possible. This is the kind of writing that makes it possible for us to solve problems with others, communicate the news, study issues, and so on. But there's another kind of writing, and this is what in higher education is called writing to learn. It's writing to learn has a different objective. Rather than communicating to an audience the way we do with transactional writing, the goal of writing to learn is to use writing to deepen our thinking. So this all sounds pretty good, but what does it actually look like? As I mentioned before, writing to learn is not focused on a particular outcome or product like transactional writing is. Instead, writing to learn is more process focused. Writing to learn activities are meant to be low stakes activities that can help learners prepare for or think through larger questions or projects. For example, I've often used informal writing warm-ups at the beginning of undergraduate political theory classes I've taught. Warm-up questions help students clarify questions they have, which then makes discussions more productive. But writing warm-ups are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to writing to learn activities. So writing to learn activities can be very wide-ranging. They can be any activities that ask learners to write as a way to think through ideas, process, or plan for other tasks or deliverables they might have. So as I mentioned, these activities are generally low stakes, which means that learners don't have to worry about being evaluated. It encourages them to be more creative while also working within a structure that you give them. For example, in higher education contexts, journals and, oops, sorry about that. We're good. What I was saying was in higher education contexts, journals and logs are simple, low stakes ways to ask learners to be accountable for observations, like in a lab setting, or readings is in a humanities or social science class. And over time, the practice of keeping a log or journal allows learners to see their progress for themselves, which is just one way that higher levels of thinking can develop out of a writing to learn activity. So that's just one example on this list. You can see there are many others. And I'll share my list of resources at the end as well. There's a great resource called the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse, which goes into a lot of detail about different types of writing to learn activities. So we'll have a chance to discuss some more examples as we talk about how learners develop higher level thinking. But to do that, we first need to transition to talk about Bloom's taxonomy. So many of you, I know many instructional designers often come from teaching backgrounds first, and so you may have run across Bloom's taxonomy already. It's widely used in K-12 and higher education settings as a tool to map educational objectives as achievable tasks. The taxonomy has actually been around since the 1950s. Its original categories included knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And what you might notice about those categories is that they're more outcome focused, with the emphasis on what the final product might look like that learners would produce. They would gain knowledge, they would show comprehension, they would produce an application, and so on. But in 2001, a group of scholars revised the taxonomy to become more process-oriented. The new version of the taxonomy used verbs to describe what learners would do to achieve educational goals. And this new version made it much easier to clarify what skills and abilities learners needed to succeed. And it's that version I'm going to show you. So this is a version of the 2001 revised version of Bloom's taxonomy. Notice how this visual places the categories in a pyramid structure, with each category building on the last one. As learners develop skills in each category, they move up the pyramid into higher levels of thinking. This process of moving between levels is critical. As instructional designers, we need to design learning activities that help learners use skills, not just at each level of the pyramid, but also we need to design learning activities that give learners the tools they need to make the transition from one level to the next. And this is where writing to learn can come in. So let's just look at the bottom three categories in the pyramid first. One way I've done this with writing to learn activities in helping students or learners move from one level of the pyramid to the next is by sequencing learning activities in ways that the materials build one on the other. So as they develop more foundational skills, they're able to build on new skills and move into higher levels of thinking. So along the way, I'll reinforce what students have learned already and invite them to take that next step. So for now, I'll just share an example from my teaching in higher education But we'll talk about writing to learn in an instructional design context too. So here you'll see we have remember, understand, and apply. You are learning the language first, then observing, classifying, organizing information, being able to explain it to others, and then starting to problem solve. So that's sort of the framework we're going to look at. Okay, so for example, in an undergraduate history class I taught, I first introduced students to terminology they would need to understand the material they would be studying. I asked each student to identify words they were unfamiliar with in one of the first readings in the class, then look them up, then look up their definitions and context. This was a low stakes writing to learn activity because I wasn't evaluating the quality of their written definition. It was simply designed to help them remember unfamiliar words and to put them in their historical context so that later they would be able to use this field-specific language in their writing and research. This was the remember phase of Bloom's taxonomy. Soon after that exercise that I just described, I took students to the Cleveland Museum of Art, which had a large collection of objects related to the material in the course I was teaching. After a talk from an expert in the galleries, I gave students time on their own to identify a few objects to observe and reflect on. They completed 3 open-ended reflection questions in which they were asked to write down their detailed observations and questions. So again, I didn't want them to spend lots and lots of time questioning, oh, is this the right question to ask? I wanted them to observe and write down what came to mind. So it was a way of generating thinking. It was also very low stakes, just like the definitions I talked about, because there were no expectations about right answers. Instead, through writing, the students were able to process connections they were making between what they were seeing in the museum, what they had read, and what they had discussed previously in class. They were going beyond remembering concepts and beginning to understand them in a related context. Finally, to move to the apply phase, I began inviting students to consider how the central concepts of the course were relevant to modern day situations. In this case, the central concept of the course was the idea of schism in a religious sense, which refers to severe fragmentation to a shared identity or community. Students ran with this idea and wrote short informal discussion boards in which they thought about modern day schisms, which to them ranged from divisions in American politics to hip hop and gender identity. We don't have enough time to keep this example going and discuss the later phases of Bloom's taxonomy, but this is kind of a model of showing how one writing to learn activity can build on a prior one and lead learners into that next level of thinking that's required. Okay, so we're gonna move into looking at writing to learn instructional design and ask ourselves, how does this apply in this context? So just a quick intro, you just need to tweak the approach because writing to learn is a higher ed based approach. Just tweak it a little bit to meet the needs of your specific client. So here's a quick tool to do that. This is called the Rhetorical Triangle. And this is, I have adapted, as you can see here, the Rhetorical Triangle invites us to think about the writer or speaker, the audience that we're writing for, and what the audience's needs are, so the context, the mode or medium in which we're going to communicate the message that meets the audience's need. For us as instructional designers, our audience is our client, and often also our client's audience, because, like, for example, a client's employees may ultimately be writing a training for them with the client's goals for that training in mind. So we have to keep both in mind. You know these things already as instructional designers. This is just a way of laying it out so that when you start to think about using writing to learn, you can put it in terms of, okay, what kind of writing will help meet the needs of the context? What kinds of writing are can be used in the mode I choose to create the message, you know, whether that's e-learning, whether it's virtual instructor-led training, whatever the case may be. So I'm just going to lead us into a little discussion now of an instructional design case study, thinking about these levels from Bloom's taxonomy and how we can use writing to learn activities to help learners achieve what they need to in our instructional design work. So we have, for example, I tried to keep this general so it would apply to more people and the kinds of clients you may be working with. So we have our client, which is restaurant chain A, you know. They want to revamp their training. It needs to be streamlined. The mode, it may be flexible because we may have learners who are going to take the training in a variety of different ways. So in looking at this, the first thing you might be thinking is restaurant employees don't need to be able to write. And well, that's maybe true that writing isn't one of the skills that they need to perform in their daily jobs with customers. It can still be a useful tool for processing learning as they progress through training. So for example, restaurant employees have to remember a lot of information, from what time the coffee gets brewed and emptied to the temperatures the refrigerator goods needs to stay at, how long items can stay in the freezer before they can go on the shelves, and so on. Over time, employees in a restaurant remember these things because they do them over and over again. But at first, when they're brand new, they need a way to digest that kind of it's a lot of information. This is where a writing to learn activity using new terms, maybe not unlike the one I described in my history class, could help in the remember phase. So at this point, and that just gets us started on the bottom of the triangle there, I want to bring in Melanie as another voice in this discussion to maybe share a little about your experience in working with instructional design clients and what do you and what your thoughts are in because I know Melanie is a former teacher as well and is an instructional designer who's worked with different done trainings in her past work as well. So I know that she has ideas to contribute to this discussion. So Melanie, what do you think about if we were going to help learners move from the remember phase to these next phases in the pyramid? Are there ways we might be able to use writing to do that in a training like this?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the ways that I would look at this and approach this is especially moving from, let's say, apply to analyze, where you're jumping from the lower levels to the upper levels. One of the things I would do is use writing to learn where the learner starts with apply and ends with analyze. So we may do a two-part activity where there is some blending of concepts, of apply concepts and analyze concepts in order to bridge that distance between those two levels.
So what kinds of activities might you do for, I mean, restaurant employees aren't necessarily the type of people who would necessarily want to do a lot. I mean, maybe some would want to do writing, but some might think, oh gosh, this is like English class. And they don't, and that might not be what they want.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really important with adult learners in particular is to help them get a better sense of why they're doing what they're doing. So
Absolutely.
if a lot of it entails helping people to think through why they're doing this exercise in order to be able to be better at your job, this exercise will facilitate your ability to do this because is the type of explanation. Maybe not in that language. I would simplify it for adult learners because you might have a broad audience, but I would use those concepts of, if I'm thinking about it as almost as like a sentence frame,
Yeah.
in order to do X, you'll benefit because of Y.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just one idea that's coming to my mind as I'm thinking about this, you know, customer relationships and how
Mhm.
employees talk with customers is really important. And sometimes it can be a challenge to figure out how do we get this message across of the way it's appropriate to communicate with customers in a training. Well, writing about it might be one way to go about it, to have almost some written dialogue from here's what the customer might say, almost like a writing role play in a way
Mhm.
that would invite new employees to be creative about what they might say or do in response to different customers. And yes, there would be right answers because most restaurants would have specific ways that they want employees to respond to customers. But it's really important to make it non-evaluative to say, hey, I know that this is the way you might respond to this kind of idea from a customer in general if you weren't the employee, but in your role as an employee, these are the ways that you need to respond. And to hear that after you've had the chance to go through, oh, now I understand why I can't joke with that customer about a concept that I didn't understand that they brought up. Maybe they're gluten-free and I don't know what that means as an employee, but now I know how I am supposed to respond, but through writing through it, I can understand, okay, this is what my natural inclination is, but this is what my role is as a restaurant employee.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really helpful is to give a writing assignment that is super clear, and also that is applicable to the job, like you're saying. So,
Yeah.
for example, one of the activities that I've done, and I know you've done as well, is a silent dialogue. And that's where you have a large sheet of paper. You can use butcher paper. You can use a really like one of the giant Post-it notes, and everybody's got a marker. And the people who are engaging in this silent dialogue are responding to each other. One as the restaurant employee, the other one as the customer, the client, and talking about how, hey, how are you? Let's build some rapport, but let's
Yeah.
build appropriate rapport. How would we do that? Let's role play it, but when you role play it in a way that engages writing, it makes it A, more real in some ways, B, it makes it more codified because of the way that it is on paper. And C, it also helps to make it more visual and to help that stick. And so when people are doing a role play through silent dialogue, that can really help move them through these different levels of Bloom's taxonomy in a way
Yeah.
that's really meaningful for them and that sticks in their minds.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and what you're describing too could work really well in an in-person or an e-learning context. Sure, because you could carry out a silent dialogue through an online format easily.
Mhm.
Yeah. The other thing I think I want to make sure we get to that highest level, the highest point on the pyramid is create. And because I think sometimes it gets forgotten, even in higher ed contexts, because we think, especially in higher ed contexts, a lot about, application analysis and evaluation. But create is really important because that's where learners are really able to say, hey, I've really mastered something and I can make something now, and I think that there are, and it's very empowering for learners. So I think it's really important for us to think about how do we, what is it that we want learners to be able to create by the end? And, maybe that's something that can be done with writing, but maybe that goes beyond writing too. That's almost a bigger discussion in a way. But I did want to make sure I brought that in as well.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's really helpful when you're working in create is that you are constructing knowledge. And when we look at it from a constructivist perspective, and you're actually building an understanding of something through the creation, whether it's of something tangible or something intangible, you are not only reinforcing what you have learned over the previous stages of Bloom's taxonomy, but you're ultimately developing something beyond that. That's why I really like the triangle image, because it's almost as if it's the tip of an arrow. It's leading you into something beyond where you've been up to this point in your learning process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So actually, that's a nice way to kind of bring some closure to the discussion. So thank you very much for bringing in your thoughts so that we could make this more of a discussion for others who may be listening. And yeah, thank you very much. I hope that this will be useful for those of you who are listening. As I mentioned, I do have a few resources here, which you're welcome to take a look at. The Writing to Learn resources are really, there's a wealth of information there. So I would welcome you to take a look at that. And thank you again for listening.